Voices Radio.
Voices Radio. Voices as in radio.
Voices
Radio.
Radio.
Hello and welcome to I Was Just Wondering with me, Tom Salmon, the show that dives into music, film and games and everything else in between. And my guest on this week's show is the artist, educator and the director of the Crypt Gallery and co-director of London Drawing, Anne Noble-Partridge. Hello, Anne.
Hello.
Welcome to the show, the first I Was Just Wondering on Voices Radio. So for people who aren't familiar with your work as a figurative artist and educator, who are you and what do you do?
Okay, so that's quite a complicated question, weirdly, because I do a lot of things. Yeah, you got in touch with me because I run the Crypt Gallery.
Yeah.
Which is an amazing space underneath St Pancras Church, and it's still a crypt. There's 568 bodies buried down there, and we very respectfully use that as a gallery. So I run that gallery, and I also run my own company, which is called London Drawing, and I've been doing that for about 15 years.
Right.
And we run big drawing events, immersive drawing events. We work with artists, galleries, performance artists, and we also run live drawing classes and workshops.
Brilliant. Well, so just before we get into all that, I just want to get the hardest question out of the way first. And what is art? And I'll frame it by giving my answer first because I think that's kind of like fair. So for me, art is communication which can transcend time, space, and language. But for you, what is art?
Wow. Okay, so another quite big question there.
Yeah, get the big one out of the way first.
What is art? Well, I don't know. I mean, I guess in a really annoyingly general way, it's whatever you want it to be.
Right.
And I think that's the essence of it, really. Art is a very personal thing. So you can create art in so many different ways, like just by the way you dress, you know, by the music that you make. I think if you're expressing yourself, then you're making art, and that's quite an ancient, like fundamental kind of primal thing.
So, so there's I guess like there's a sort of theory of like, does art have to exist inside the art gallery? Would you say does it have to be a defined sort of like space in order to exist, and in terms of just beyond like the everyday, basically?
Well, I think it used to be like that for a long time, and over the last sort of 20 years, I really think that's changed. Yeah, art sort of reflects society as a whole a little bit more now. I think a lot of the time real art happens in a kind of unconscious way. So confining it to a gallery in a conventional sense, like a sort of white cube gallery, it's maybe one way of doing it, but there's so many different ways of doing it. I guess a lot of the things that I've done over the past 10 or 15 years have sort of maybe challenge that a little bit. I don't want to sound like I'm kind of pompous or anything like that, but within the small kind of niche world of life drawing, we really sort of challenged that, and off the back of that, it's really kind of like blossomed into a kind of a huge sort of movement, particularly in London, but now kind of globally. Now it's gone online.
Yeah. So just before we jump into that, I just want to go back to sort of day zero, and just go back to the first time that you went to an art gallery, your first ever time. And what was the one piece of art that you saw there, if you can remember, that really sort of struck you and that spoke to your burgeoning artistic sensibilities? Well,
I was thinking about that, and you know what? I was trying to think, like, what's the first time that I really came into contact with art, and it really. I really sort of decided that I wanted to kind of go down that path. And actually, it wasn't an art gallery. It was at Glastonbury.
Oh, okay.
Around 1991.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So Glastonbury then was quite a different sort of scene than it is now. Very much sort of more open and free and a bit wild. And perhaps this is a bit of a kind of curveball answer to your question. But at Glastonbury, I remember I was about 16 and I saw... people really expressing themselves and doing their thing and not having a 9-to-5 job and being a performance artist or a magician or a trapeze artist. I remember sitting like watching the trapeze artists in one of the fields, and I was very young, obviously, but I really thought, wow, okay, like this has really opened my eyes to what you can do.
Yeah.
You know, because at school I would sit down and they'd like in the careers office, they'd say, what are you going to do? And I never really wanted to be an artist. I wanted to be a dancer.
Right.
But it never really felt like a sort of career option until I went to Glastonbury. And then I thought, okay, I can be creative in whatever way that I want to be, you know, and as long as people are interested, you know, and I'm interested in what I'm doing, then I can, you know, make something of that. And that's what I did.
So were you like just a naturally like curious child? Because I know that sometimes people can live with the confines of where they find themselves, and that's as far as they'll ever reach. And then there's other people that reach out further, that want to express themselves. But was there a particular point for you where you realised that perhaps you may be different from other sort of classmates in terms of your appreciation for culture, shall we say?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, like I say, my roots were when I was a child mainly in dancing and performing.
Right. Yeah.
And I did art, but I didn't really want to be an artist particularly. But I used to, when I was a kid, like gather all like, my little friends in the local area together, and we used to do shows in our garage.
Right.
And I used to like direct everything. So we'd make the costumes, we'd do routines. Like my brother and his friend would do little comedy acts. Like my dad would be the stage manager, you know. And as I've kind of grown up and sort of developed my career, actually that's kind of what I do now. I gather people together and I sort of do the styling and the creative direction, and I sort of manage the whole thing, which is weirdly what I was doing in my garage when I was like 8.
So your parents have always been supportive of your ambition to be an artist, and were they creative inclined themselves?
Not in a conventional way, no. I didn't really kind of come from a sort of artistic background particularly. My dad was always like really interested in art. He used to take me to the ballet and like sort of take me to museums and stuff like that, but neither of my parents are artists in that kind of a sense.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, it just kind of came out.
Okay. Right. So I understand, just moving on from that question, I guess educationally sort of speaking, you graduated from the University of Hertfordshire with a BA Honours in Fine Art back in 1997. And I was just doing a bit of research in that period of time in terms of like British art. And so it was around that time Damien Hirst had his Sensation exhibition, which opened at the Saatchi Gallery. So around that time you were graduating, there was this huge YBA movement that was going on. So what was your biggest sort of artistic takeaway from your moment in that time?
Well, I remember I went to Sensation, that exhibition. And yeah, I mean, it was a really exciting time to be graduating. The main thing that I actually remember from that show was Dead Dad, which was a piece, and suddenly the name of the artist has escaped me.
So I vaguely just
I'm trying to remember.
Over it. Was it the Bloodhead? What the guys?
No, it was this really realistic sculpture of a very kind of small man, naked man lying on the floor. It's like hyper real. Ron Muick.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
And actually, do you know what? Around that time. What I do now, so more sort of figurative art and like life drawing and it's sort of exploring life drawing, actually was hugely unfashionable in those days. Yeah. So weirdly, I felt quite a lot sort of on the outside of the art world. And it felt like, for some reason, what I was interested in wasn't kind of cool or fashionable, but I thought, how can that be not cool or fashionable if I'm interested in it? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's quite a weird time to be doing what I was doing. I actually ended up doing like underwater photography and film and video, and it was all figurative based. Yeah. But not really in sort of more traditional kind of drawing or painting. Yeah. Because no one really was doing it, and I wasn't encouraged to do that in those days.
Really?
It was massively unfashionable, yeah.
So what was at university, what were your lecturers sort of like pushing at that time before this big explosion of YBA happened?
Well, I mean, I originally went to an art college in St Albans.
Right.
And that was like, I guess what you say, a little bit more traditional, I suppose.
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess it was just seen as quite sort of unfashionable, weirdly. Like everyone was like doing Damien Hirst and chopping things up and like, you know, sort of making sort of performance art or conceptual stuff.
Yeah.
And if you did more figurative based stuff, then you just didn't really kind of get anywhere. You just sort of got ignored. So for a while I was quite disillusioned with the art world.
I can imagine,
Yeah.
yeah, because there was a huge, I guess, like, because at that point, like, artists, and I was thinking about points in time of, like, art that 30 years after that kind of, like, happened, and there just seems to be this sort of vacuum that was created by that. They came out and sucked a huge amount of, like, money and also, I guess, like, culture of art, like British art, and then there was just a huge vacuum ever after because they just occupied that position. It didn't seem 10 years afterwards there was another wave of exciting artists that were getting patronised by, say, someone like Charles Saatchi or Larry Bogosian, I guess, is the more American sort of side of thing. So that just sort of like follows on actually onto my sort of next question nicely. So after the months you graduated university, away from the routine of working in a studio, art crits, like private viewings, art student sort of hangouts where you could literally just talk out art for hours, and then you got into the real world. So how did you start finding your feet in the real world of like contemporary or commercial art after you graduated?
Well, I think it can be quite disorientating coming out of art college because you're in this sort of little bubble in a way.
Yeah.
And when you come out, it's like, how do you be an artist? How do you make money out of that? You know,
Yeah.
and a lot of people don't, and they just don't become artists, and they don't do that. You know, they go to art college and then they go off on a career and do something completely different. And we see a lot of those people coming back to the classes that I run now.
Right.
But yeah, I came out of art college. I felt quite disillusioned with the whole thing because I didn't really know like how to proceed. You know, there was no like path, and also what I was really interested in was quite unfashionable. So for quite a while, I didn't really follow like an artistic path. Like, I worked in a pub. I did all the sign writing there.
Yeah.
But I think because art isn't a sort of linear path. You have to be quite self-sufficient. And actually, when I was at art college, the art college that I went to, it was in a massive transition at the time, and it wasn't massively fashionable. It wasn't kind of hugely like academic or any of those things. But what it did teach me was to kind of be independent. There was a really sort of independent scene because there wasn't a huge amount going on at the University of Hertfordshire at that time. So we had to kind of just get on with it and do like homemade stuff.
Yeah.
And that really has sort of like formed my kind of way of doing things ever since. So actually, although the experience of art college was a bit weird, it made me quite self-sufficient.
Yeah.
You know, and I just decided that I would do what I wanted to do rather than what was fashionable, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So I was kind of drawn to sort of towards doing stuff that I liked rather than trying to be cool or any of those things. And through doing volunteering, I did quite a lot of volunteering in galleries and institutions. I worked as an assistant to a blind art student for a couple of years, and I assisted her doing her degree, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
And I just kind of tried out loads of stuff, and ended up working in an art gallery, and through that ended up teaching life drawing, and then started doing more and more life drawing and kind of getting into that scene.
Yeah.
And then I was invited to teach at Tate Modern.
Right.
And that really kind of, we ripped up the rule book and like went mental.
Yeah. So just to put like a sort of time frame on that period, how long did it take you from being like a disillusioned art student to kind of getting to the Tate? And because I think oftentimes like creativity expands and it contracts, and sometimes it needs to contract for you to be able to move to the next thing. So how long did it take you to sort of navigate through that, and also what kind of what motivated you to just basically like keep on going through that?
Yeah, well, I graduated in 1997 and we started working at the Tate in 2006.
Right.
So that was about 11 years. So I was so it took a while. That's the thing.
Yeah.
So it's not an immediate thing. I mean, sometimes it is. Depends who you are and what you're doing. But it's not an immediate thing a lot of the time. And you just got to kind of plug away at it and have your fingers in lots of pies in order to be able to kind of earn a living.
Yeah.
So I think I've tried to, all the time, with all the work that I've done, always had a sort of creative element to it. Even when I was working in the pub, I was doing like sign writing for the pub. So like every job that I've had, there's been a sort of creative element to it. And if you're in that creative environment, you meet creative people and you make those connections and that networking. And then that is the really useful thing, making those connections.
So I'd just like to jump in on actually your practice, which is exclusive figuratively, we talked about, which was terribly unfashionable when you sort of started out, but it centres on the theme of the body in space. And so going from doing sort of sign writing and then also doing your sort of side projects, how has that developed over the years working in the commercial art space, and have you had to change obviously you're very passionate about exclusive figurative work, but has that even had to sort of change within the commercial space to maybe do figurative work that's more commercial, should we say, for a better word?
Well, I think over the time that I've been doing it, actually, there's been like a huge kind of turnaround in the art world generally.
Yeah.
And for a long time, there's been a massive kind of figurative, like, a sort of undercurrent, like grassroots sort of movement.
Mm-hmm.
And that has, over the last like 15 years, really kind of blossomed. So just through doing what I'm doing, I've kind of caught that wave.
Right, yeah.
You know, so it's often these things are cyclical, you know. And when I was at art college, it was massively unfashionable. And now it's kind of really come back in. And like, if we're right next to Central St Martin's here.
Yeah.
I've taught at Central St Martin's many times, you know, so having gone from being massively unfashionable, now it, like, you know, I teach at Central St Martin's, and a lot of the students there, they want an easel and they want a studio, they want to do figurative work and they want to explore that stuff, and they can't because those things aren't at Central St Martin's.
Really?
Yeah, because
wow.
you know, so the art colleges are sort of slightly kind of behind a little bit now with what's kind of really current in lots of ways. But I think when I started working at the Tate, I mean, that was 2006, that was quite a while ago now, like no one was really kind of treating the figure and life drawing in a contemporary way. I think the art colleges didn't really know what to do with it because it was quite unfashionable. It's like, well, why do something so unfashionable? Yeah. But when I was working at the Tate, it just seemed ridiculous to do it in a conventional way. You know, when you're there in the Turbine Hall or you're in a Gilbert and George exhibition, you know, like, how do you relate life drawing to that? So we started using the model as a sort of conduit through which to explore concepts and materials and processes. So all of a sudden it became a much more kind of contemporary sort of language that we're using with regard to life drawing. And off the back of that now, like 15 years later, like there's a huge kind of movement of using life drawing to explore body image, sexuality, gender, art generally, performance art, like the whole shebang. Like that is something that everyone does now. But when we were doing it at the Tate, no one really was. So we've kind of like ridden this sort of wave. And the art colleges are just kind of catching up now, weirdly.
Oh, nice. So just before we jump into that, I've got a few questions sort of later on for you about, but I'd just like to locate your terms of your practice, and in terms of who would you say is your, maybe three is a bit much, but in terms of your inspiration for figurative work. So I was looking at your Instagram page, and from what I could see, the figurative work was quite kinetic in terms of, and you do like multiple series of the same person. So it looked, obviously, it's like almost like I don't know if this is the right word, but sort of a triptych of motion of a person sort of like turning. And I recently went to the Crypt Gallery and I saw Cézanne's figurative work, who's supposed to be, he is the godfather of like contemporary art in terms of like form and colour. And I weirdly, maybe this is a huge jump, would sort of like trace back to sort of like Cézanne and then through the interlude of those preceding sort of like artists. Would you say that sort of influenced your work in some sort of capacity?
Yeah, I mean, again, like, if you talked about Cézanne like 20 years ago, you'd been laughed out of the room, you know, like, but now it feels a lot easier now that life drawing is kind of has become contemporary. You can then look back and appreciate again. Like, I was in Amsterdam over the weekend. We went to the Wright Museum and saw lots of Rembrandts, you know, and you say the word Rembrandt, it's like Van Gogh. You have these images in your mind, think, oh right, yeah, I know what that is. But until you actually see it in person and you're there in front of it, and it's like, wow, that is intense, like insanely skilled and beautiful, and there's lots of kind of layers, sort of conceptually as well as like actually in the work. I think now it's much easier to sort of look back on historical work and sort of see it in a new light in a way. So I mean, my influences are like huge, right from, you know, like Rembrandt and Renaissance art through to like there's a huge fashion or sort of trend at the moment for more kind of like sort of pagan sort of style art where people are really exploring the occult and spiritualism, maybe you know, because of the pandemic, but also you know, through like sort of gender and sort of you know, like exploring the self, you know. So I think at the moment it's a really interesting time, you know, you can sort of pick and choose from any sort of point in art history and really kind of relate to it at the moment, I think.
Yeah, which brings me sort of nicely on to actually viewing art into your role as director of the Crypt Art Gallery. So we spoke about it's in the middle of Houston with 568
Yes.
bodies, did you say?
Yeah.
Buried there. So what was the journey from obviously seeing that space for the first time and then seeing the potential for an art gallery there?
Well, weirdly, again, it's one of these kind of synchronistic things.
Yeah.
That's often what happens, I think, as an artist.
Yeah.
I first came in contact with the crypt through my partner's father,
Right.
who was the vicar at St Pancras Church.
Oh wow, yeah.
And they were trying to decide what to do with the crypt. They were thinking maybe about turning it into a cafe or, like a community space. And my partner's dad said, come down and have a look. It's really cool. So we went down and had a look. And I thought, wow, this is an amazing space. Like, I can totally imagine performance or art or like it'd be a great creative space, but like, don't do anything to it. Just leave it as it is. Not that they were using me as some kind of consultancy or something, but in the end, that kind of is what happened. So I've been running the gallery for about 8 years, something like that.
Right.
So I wasn't there when it was set up. I was actually working at Candid Arts Trust, which is a big art centre in Angel.
Okay, yeah.
And I did a lot of art administration there. And I remember like sort of seeing the gallery and thinking, oh wow, it's so cool they've turned that into a gallery. It'd be really cool to work there.
Yeah.
Cool to run that. I could do that.
Yeah.
And then I don't know, it's like I guess I'm manifesting.
Right, yeah.
Just by thinking about it and saying it,
Yeah.
And then when the administrator left, the church got in touch with me because they knew that I'd done a lot of art administration. I was sort of in the art world, and they wanted someone to run it that was maybe had a new sort of fresh pair of eyes. So I just said, yeah, okay, I'll do that. And I started running the gallery. So that's my sort of history there.
Right, and it is an amazing space because I remember I was studying actually in Burbank just around the corner, and I just jumped up randomly, just walked down that street and went down, and it's such an amazing space. And I think. And so one of my next question, is thinking about contemporary British art galleries, and I mean, basically the building's not necessarily the art on display there, like the White Cube that we've sort of spoken about, Saatchi Gallery, the Turner Contemporary in Margate. They're pretty much the same space, polished concrete floors, white walls, massive bay windows. And to my mind, they seem quite homogenised and academic, which I feel that can be a barrier to entry for the general public, whereas somewhere as the Crypt, in a sense that's ancient, and that's to do with like community, it's to do with religion, it's a religious sort of like space. It's a generally welcoming space for whoever you are, and you can go down there and interact with the art. And also the thing that I've sort of like noticed is what I like to do, so there's the Crypt Art Gallery, there's a welcome collection, smaller space with a small amounts of art where you can dip in for like 20 minutes, experience it, and then go. It's not, you're not overwhelmed.
Yeah. I mean, what I really love about the Crypt Gallery, and I guess that's why I'm there and why I'm sort of running it, is that I really try not to have a sort of house style.
Yeah.
I try not to monitor the stuff that's going in too much, because you can make personal judgments about art.
Yeah.
And you're sort of like imposing your own sort of aesthetic onto it, or your own ideas of what's cool. And a lot of the time, you don't really know what's going to happen until everyone's in there. And something that looks a bit rubbish on paper could actually be really quite interesting in the space, So I try not to judge things too much.
Yeah.
And that works really well within the Crypt Gallery space. It feels like when people go down there, like genuinely, they feel like they're going into a different world. It's quite immersive. And like you say, it's a very kind of weirdly welcoming space, although it's very damp and like potentially
dark,
kind of a little bit scary. The vibe that comes off the space is a really interesting one, that people can really relate to somehow. So you get all kinds of people going down there, from like tourists who just happen to be walking past, to people who live in the area, people who work in the area, or people coming especially to see the show. It's really sort of special space, I think.
Yeah, it is. So just following on from that question, I know that you don't have a curated set of artists you've mentioned that are coming in and going to display work. So the last time that I went to the Crypt Art Gallery was like last week, and I went to see the greatly titled The Vomit Vault of London, A Salute to Puke, which I have to say, other than the sort of like, well, you could say the necessarily like puerilness or like toilet humanness of it, was for me one of my favourite art exhibitions I've been to recently, because for me, when you looked behind the actual, just the image in itself, and looked beyond and into the sort of like puke, if you will, to see that it became a sort of like a social, economic sort of comment on society. And I had a nice chat with the two ladies that were moderating or by the door, and there's something they spoke about. And I guess, like, for me, with the impending sort of like food crisis, like cost of living, in terms of what people are able to sort of like throw up, and the luxury of being able to sort of throw up in the street, and the people that have to sort of clean it up, it threw a lot of things into...
Well, it's quite cathartic, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's like almost like a Pollock or something. It does have that sort of like motion, that sort of loss of control.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's an interesting show that you saw there.
Yeah.
That was by Bumpas and Parr, who are actually quite well-known sort of artists, creators.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a kind of social comment, I think, that, and it was a comment on the pandemic as well, and sort of coming out of that, and the sort of like the cathartic sort of nature of it.
Yeah.
It's not typical of a show at the Crypt Gallery. However, I have to say, because we don't have a house style, it is massively eclectic. So we did a huge show last year which went on for a month, and that was about sort of queerness and sort of paganism,
right?
And that was like, we had thousands of people coming through the door.
Yeah.
So we do like sort of host big sort of shows like that.
Yeah.
And then much smaller ones where it's maybe just an artist coming in and just testing stuff out in the gallery, like during sort of times where it's not that busy. I sort of organise residencies, so people can play in the space and bounce off it a bit and sort of create things. Like we had an artist called Dominic Blake who came in for a week in the summer last year, and he just responded to the space with his body, like making little videos and sounds. And he was just kind of down there for a week, like sort of like naked most of the time, sort of responding to the space, so I think it's really important to have that that things like you saw, which are quite kind of sort of high end, like organized shows, right through to people just messing about, which is really important when it comes to creativity, So I think it's important to have that wide range of things happening.
Yeah, and I also think like a lot of stuff that ends up in art galleries is either something that a collector or patron has bought that wants on display to increase the value of it, because I guess like it's the iceberg of art that we only see the 1%, and like now essentially art is just purely reduced to the price tag. It's not like artists can be particularly controversial now. The only thing we hear about art is like how much somebody's bought it for, not that it's particularly shocking in that way. I
mean, I guess, well, it's like with everything, it depends where you look for your art, doesn't it, really? Yeah. But I mean, that's what I found a bit, I was just very disillusioned with the art world generally when I left art college, because that's all I could see. Yeah. But it's only when you kind of sort of get into it and go underneath and sort of see beyond that you find where the real art is happening. Yeah. At places like the Crypt.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So just sort of moving on to London Drawing, which you said you started back in 2006. As we've spoken about, I just wonder, in terms of the genesis of that, was there a moment where you were sat somewhere and you just suddenly, the light went off, there was a creative and entrepreneurial spark, you were like, oh, I need to push the boundaries of figurative drawing, of live drawing, and then you slowly started to... And essentially, was that built off your sort of that disillusionment, I guess, as well? Was there almost like a convergence of things that happened?
Yeah, I suppose so. Because, like I was saying, it felt odd to me that I could be so interested and so engaged and really want to do something that was so uncool.
Yeah.
And it was really when we were asked to run the classes at the Tate, that light bulb moment happened.
Yeah.
You know, because they'd done a few classes there, and the tutor just kind of stuck the model in front of a piece of artwork, and everyone had just drawn the model. There was no connect between what was going on around them in the gallery and what they were drawing. So that really gave us the opportunity to like rip up the rule book a bit and rethink how you can respond to a human being. Essentially, it doesn't have to be life drawing in a conventional sense. You know, it can be all manner of things, you know. So that really was the light bulb moment for me, where I suddenly realized that you can work with a life model as an artist. So a lot of the life models that we work with are performers or writers or musicians, or you know, they're doing it as a side gig, or in those days they were. And I suddenly thought, like, surely we can use all this potential. So it's more like we started sort of collaborating with models. So sort of thinking about the model in a different way, I think, was like quite key to the whole thing. You know, sort of working with the model instead of using them as an object just to draw from. And that sort of switch in mindset, that set us off on a path. And if you look into the life drawing scene globally now, or even, you know, just in London, you could see that happening everywhere now.
Yeah, and so one of the earliest events that I could kind of see was a drawing event that you put on, Drawing Theatre with Paul Kingsley at the Shoreditch Town Hall in 2013, which I could see from the short video that was on the website was a mixture of like live performance, music, them interacting with like a canvas, and then people drawing the interaction with it, which I guess like also explored the body, like they were like, I guess like naked, there was nakedness and that kind of thing. So from that, and in terms of where your live drawing events, where can you remember if that one was like one of the very first one, or was that like?
It was very near the beginning, because when we worked at the Tate for about 6 years, and we would do classes there on a Monday, and it was just a couple of hours in the gallery. And we were just thinking, you know what, like it feels like there's potential to do stuff other than just here and now at the Tate. Although obviously it's amazing to work at Tate Modern. If you're going to do like massive life drawing events anyway, you want to do it at Tate Modern. But we thought, how can we sort of move on and go beyond this? Because you know, you can't work at Tate Modern forever, and we didn't. True. And we just thought, okay, well, what elements are there at Tate Modern? What is working there? You know, you've got the environment. You've got the models, you've got sound, you've got the artwork on the walls. So how can you sort of recreate that environment and make it this sort of immersive experience? And that's when I started putting together venues. So Shoreditch Town Hall, for example, which has got an underneath sort of basement space. And we work with Paul Kindersley, who's a performance artist. And he has a very kind of strong, like visual aesthetic, almost like sort of creating big visual 3D collages. You've got the sound as well, that you can, like, you know, you can sort of play sound or have a sound artist there too. And you've got all the people drawing down there. So this big, like, creative exchange happening where the audience or the participants, they're not just sitting watching, and there isn't that disconnect between the people drawing and the people being drawn. They're all like creating together. So once we realized that we could do that kind of set us off onto this sort of path of, you know, sort of much more kind of collaborative, sort of performative way of working. But it all started at the Tate.
I see. And another thing I would sort of like say, just a comment on that, is that like there's two separate forms of art, and it's I guess like its sort of function and how people interact with it. So there's the catharticness of actually being able to create a piece of work which you work through from your own emotional perspective and your own technique, and then there's the one where you go to a gallery and you view said work, which is again like the artwork is it's in the gallery, it's presented, it's against other art galleries, there's a context for it. We don't necessarily, to my mind, really talk about the actual benefit of actually just creating art and not necessarily having to be like the 1% of artists that's going to get paid for it. There is a real function of being able to create a piece of art for your own, I guess, like well-being, spiritual, however you want to say it. And I just don't see at the moment, the focus is always on like the end product and not necessarily on the creative journey. So I don't know if that's something that you've sort of encountered. Yeah,
well, I mean, like I say, it depends where you're looking for your art. Often in art galleries, that's the kind of, not the end point exactly, but it's the finished point a lot of the time. And what I really enjoyed about life drawing and sort of creating like these immersive like events is that it really encouraged people to be creative, and it felt like there was a massive need for that.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of the people coming to the classes and events that we run are just kind of regular people. They're not necessarily artists or even that creative in their life generally, but there's this like thing that people often come and say, oh, I used to do art at school and I haven't done it since, and I wanted to do something, you know, and they could just come along and be an artist. You know, so we can sort of provide the components that people need, you know, because on your own at home, in your room, it's a bit like, where do you start? You know, you need something to kind of bounce off. And that creating that environment where people could draw, paint, like, you know, sort of within a structure, sort of creates, you know, that sort of fulfills that need, I think. And even more so now, like over the pandemic, we did a lot of online stuff, and the audience for that was absolutely huge, you know, because people just needed something to hold on to.
And in terms of that audience, that online audience, I guess you were able to reach across the globe, so I guess you come into contact with people from all over the place. So how far and why did you manage to get people to engage in these life drawing classes?
Well, I mean, we're still doing it. We're still doing it. I was on a call this afternoon rehearsing for a class we're doing on Saturday with a model called Ali who lives in the US. And I mean, at the sort of in the height of the pandemic, we were getting like hundreds of people coming along, people from Peru, Russia, you know, like all over Europe and the US, just sort of coming along to classes, and there was a massive sort of communal experience there, you know, so it was really exciting. And we've been able to work with models from all over the world. And draw from them and sort of collaborate with them, and I mean, from that point of view, it's completely sort of changed everything.
So if somebody wanted to become a model for you, how do they go about doing that? Just in case somebody's listening would like to engage. And
people often ask that question. Well, it's a bit of a tricky one because although anyone can become an artist model, essentially. There are some people that are just really kind of tuned into it, and then other people not so much. Right. It's hard to sort of describe. I guess you need to have like a sort of I suppose a sort of treat it as a creative process. Okay. In order to kind of engage with it a little bit. So it doesn't really matter what you look like particularly. It's more your sort of approach to it. You know. And some people just intuitively kind of have that. I don't know, that sense of engaging with it. Right. Okay. And that really helps everyone to engage with it. Right, yeah. You know? So just picking up on that, I listened to a Radio 4 interview you did, and you were vocal about the importance of art students at upper school drawing new models from life to tackle issues of body dysmorphia, sex positivity and porn addiction, which was an interesting thing. So I just wondered how receptive were schools and teachers to that idea, and is that still like an ongoing discussion for you? Well, yeah, I think that's ongoing. I mean, that came off the back of an interview that I did with a newspaper. It was just an offhand comment. Right. And it kind of blew up in the January 2020, so just before the pandemic happened, and then it kind of went out the window because we all went into lockdown. But yeah, I mean, for a long time I've worked with a group called Spirited Bodies, and I've always thought that it's kind of a life drawing is an artistic thing, but it's also from a sort of well-being point of view. There's a whole nother layer to it that I really love, you know, because I think if you walk into a life room and you look at a life model, it's kind of like holding a mirror up to yourself. You know, if you don't like yourself, then it's going to be quite difficult to sort of tolerate really kind of looking at someone and really getting into drawing them. So there's a hell of a lot of self-acceptance going on in a life room in some ways. Some people walk in, they don't even think about it. They just want to do some life drawing. For other people, it's quite a strong experience to look at someone naked in that kind of vulnerable way, and also have that permission to look as well. I think life drawing, and again, I'm going to perhaps say something controversial here because it was controversial at the time. But having life drawing in schools would address so many things, you know, particularly at the moment where you've got so much imagery online and on social media, you know, of sort of bodies and the way that they're presented, to sort of introduce that via life drawing. You know, I mean, I've taught class, I used to teach a class in Highgate, and the youngest person that came along to that was like 9.
Right.
And they just come along and draw, just like everyone else. It wasn't like some kind of crazy thing. They just really enjoyed drawing. There was a whole little group of kids that would come along. And I just, you know, we just kind of interact like everyone else in the class. And I think being able to just sort of like have that permission to look and see lots of different people and bodies and like think about it in a quite a normal way instead of turning it into a big thing was really healthy. It felt kind of cool.
And just to ask a sort of deeper sort of question, in terms of what's been your relationship with, I guess, like the human body and like bodies in general in terms of like growing up, because I know typically in an English sort of fashion, we tend to be sort of like, well, to a certain, I guess it depends where you live, but quite conservative. And the only time where you would maybe see like nudity in a context that wasn't necessarily pornographic would be going to an art gallery and you would see portrait of some sort of cherubs or, you know, or like a Greek sort of like statue of something like that. So how did you locate going from, I guess, say like the idealized form portrayed through art to say like the more like naturalistic form that I guess drawing from life encourages people to examine?
Yeah. I mean, if you look to the 70s and sort of performance art, then there was a lot of sort of nudity and a lot of sort of exploration of that.
Yeah.
So it's always been there. But I mean, for me, I didn't particularly come from a massively liberal house, you know, like some families, or, you know, it depends where you're from and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But I remember when I first did a life drawing class, I was introduced to it, I was about 15, something like that, through my art teacher. I remember going in and just being totally fine with it. Like, it felt like I was at home, you know?
Right. Yeah.
And I think being able to, I mean, I've seen a lot of bodies in my life through teaching, you know, all kinds of people, all sorts of things, you know, like everyone. And it helps you to kind of love yourself a little bit, you know, like, because you when you see someone standing there and maybe, I don't know, they've got a disability, or they're a larger person, or they're a very kind of thin person, you know, like all different types of bodies. And maybe like they're much older as well. You sort of look at them and there's a massive respect there. And you look at it, it allows you to kind of contemplate your own body, if you see what I mean. You know, we're all going to get old. Yeah. All these things are going to happen. Maybe there's things that you don't like about your body, but that person's sitting there and they're okay. You know, they're all right. They're sitting there and they're allowing you to look at them. And there's something really positive, I think, about that. Very kind of fundamental, that goes beyond like advertising or, you know, all of that hyperbole, or, you know, all that stuff that goes on. It's very simple. You know, and there's something rather lovely about that. Yeah,
there is. There's something, real sort of purity. So just moving on to my last 4 questions, I just want to get your hot take on a couple of big art-related issues. So firstly, I have a friend who's a CAD designer who has zero interest in going to art galleries because he feels art isn't for him. So how would you persuade someone like that does do like a creative thing to actually engage with art?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people feel like that. But like you're saying about like Turner Contemporary or the sort of big galleries, it's a bit intimidating walking through the door. I would say it's useful to sort of think about art in a slightly different way and maybe search for it in other places. You know, I mean, if you look for art, it's all around.
Yeah, true, yeah.
That's the thing. Like, you don't have to go to a gallery to encounter art. And the more you sort of engage with it and find art that you can relate to, the more all of a sudden it's like the gallery doesn't seem so intimidating after all, you know? And I mean, the amazing thing in the UK, of course, is that like the galleries in London are free. You know, and places like Tate Modern, you know, it's just even going and looking at the architecture might be the thing that draws you in. So it's just finding what you find engaging and interesting about it, rather than this sort of weird idea of what art should be. Yeah, and there's because I guess there's 2 sides. There's the sort of visceral of looking at a piece of artwork, and then there's I can't even say the word, the intellectualization of the process of looking at, you can get caught up, I guess, like the academic sort of
outside, which brings me nicely onto my next question. So one of my pet peeves is elitist art critics, just a small set of them. They're not necessarily all art critics. I want to lump them all in. But I feel sometimes when they're talking about art, they take too much ownership of the experience of actually viewing it. They see more hidden meanings within the work that mere mortals cannot. They articulate in definitive terms about arts of work that don't allow any other form of interpretation. I feel like it can be quite exclusionary. And I'd also maybe lump in a little bit art historians who give very performative talks, as I've seen recently on YouTube, to crowds of people that look like they're struggling to stay awake. So I don't know, how do you feel about art criticism? Do you think it forms a particular
Well, I mean, it's all
function?
self-serving, isn't it, in a way? It's like the big, like white cube sort of galleries, it's sort of... You sort of pick up an artist and put them on a pedestal, and then all of a sudden their work becomes more expensive. People make money out of it. It's within their interest for it to be exclusive.
Yeah.
So I mean, I guess it goes back to what we were talking about a moment ago. It depends where you search for it.
Yeah.
And the real art is found in the everyday a lot of the time. So it's almost like there's like two different types of art in a way.
Yeah.
And that's what I've worked out. When I first came out of art college, it felt like art was this thing that other people did, this world that I couldn't work out where the goalposts were, let alone what the game was, But through being creative and sort of doing what I like and like sort of connecting with people and like going for it, I've kind of found art that works for me in a way. So yeah, I think a lot of these things are designed for it to feel exclusive and to feel like you're on the outside. But there are lots of things going on that you can get involved with that is really about creating and about art, that doesn't involve art critics and big art galleries and lots of money.
And so here's the sort of dilemma. So through my YouTube rabbit hole that I fell into, researching and engaging with contemporary art, there is this dilemma where you'll listen to Damien Hirst talk, and people constantly question him about money and about money he makes, and he doesn't seem bothered by it at all. In fact, he seems quite an opaque individual, and he's well aware of the factory process that he creates, and the interview will always question authenticity. So I think my thing is, like, would they be happy with the most authentic artist that had ever lived, that was truly about his art, but nobody had ever known about it? Surely with art there is always going to be some commerciality to it to get it in front of people, and the idea of authenticity versus money will always be a complicated one. If you had some
it's
thoughts on
complicated.
that.
I mean, I would say Damien Hirst is a businessman. First and foremost, and he's done amazingly well out of it. His art at the moment is a little bit boring. It was really interesting when he first started, but it's I think because he's a business person, I think that impetus to really make really interesting, like, fundamental art is it's just not so much there. Obviously, I'm making massive generalization there, but like. I mean, a great example is Van Gogh. In Van Gogh's lifetime, nobody bought the work. Nobody was interested in what he was doing at all. But you go to the Van Gogh Museum now, and again, even then, you could still make assumptions about it. Think, oh yeah, Van Gogh, I know what that's all about. You go to the museum, you see the wealth of the work and the skill of it, and the amount he produced. It was just like flowing out of him. Amazing, totally amazing. And now, you can't billions and billions of pounds to buy one. But when he was alive. But that's so often the difficult thing. It's like getting it out there in an authentic way. And that's the tricky bit, I suppose.
It's very tricky. Because eventually, if it's successful, it'll become a postcard in a gift shop. Like, regardless how like, authentic it is, depending on how palatable the actual work is. Because obviously, there's some Tracy Emin work that you wouldn't necessarily want that on a postcard. Or say like the Chapman brothers going back to the sensation. Which seems to be less of how we do. Okay, so I've got time for a few more questions. So. So we kind of like touched on this a little bit, but I guess like a big part of being a working artist is earning enough money to keep your practice going. So what, in your opinion, are the 3 things that an artist can do to earn money in like 2022?
That's another tricky question. Well, I mean, it goes back to that thing of like having your fingers in a lot of pies. And also, I guess, trying to make sure that whatever you do has a creative element to it, or at least finding that creative element in whatever you're doing, because often what you do to make money isn't we can't all be sort of amazing like Damien Hirst or, you know, footballers or whatever
Yeah.
to like live the dream. So yeah, I think if you've got that drive in you,
Yeah.
then you will make it happen, if you see what I mean.
I see, yeah.
You know? So I've often just really kept a lot of things going and also done some quite boring stuff. You know, on the side, I do a lot of boring stuff as
Yeah.
well as really cool stuff. You know, like it feels like when you say you're an artist, and by the way, for a long time I didn't really think about myself as an artist.
Right.
I felt like I was more an administrator.
Yeah.
So I did a lot of administration, but over the years I've kind of learned that actually I've changed my mind about the way my art manifests itself. I don't necessarily have to be drawing. Like being a creative director and styling and putting together big events, there's an art to that, definitely.
Yeah, of course.
So perhaps changing the way that you see art, like it doesn't have to be like making a painting, putting it on the wall and selling it in the gallery. You know, like you can, I think like sort of changing the way that you think about what art can be and how you can make it
Yeah.
is really, really useful, you know. So then it makes it easier to find art in what you're doing in it as a career.
So a very hard-hitting question for you now. What's the future of contemporary British art in the next 5 years?
Oh my God. Okay.
I mean, I guess like NTFs, I guess that's very popular right now. Like,
maybe, yes. I think probably like going more down the sort of homemade route, so the less kind of business orientated route, I think is definitely a thing. Sort of spirituality and like looking for some kind of higher sort of meaning, like going back to the roots of art, you know, like think about like sort of ancient civilizations, you know, like who could sort of navigate by the stars and like sort of understood the universe through their minds. You know, I think that is the future, you know. I think people are really sort of searching for a kind of something like a spiritual element to it, and that is like really coming through at the moment. And people, you know, exploring their sexuality and their gender. That's all like wrapped up in all that stuff, you know. So I think there's like people are expanding their minds, in whatever way that might take that, you know, they want to do that. Like that, I think is a sort of perhaps part of the future of art, definitely.
Yeah. And just so finally, what's your dream project if money and time wasn't an issue?
Oh. God, I don't know. Do you know what? I think like working at the Tate was a dream project.
Okay, yeah.
That was that was an amazing opportunity that I still can't believe happened now. You know, and whatever I do in my life, like that is going to be something that I always look back on and think that was amazing, and I did a brilliant thing. You know, and I've set off. And again, it wasn't just me. There were other things going on at the time, but genuinely like set off a whole sort of movement with regard to life drawing, contemporary life drawing. Yeah. And like, that's quite a cool thing to have done. I'm pleased with that.
Yeah, it is. You made a mark. And so just, I guess, like finally, where can people check out like the Crypt Art Gallery and London Drawing and what sort of events do you have going on? Where can people find you on social media, that kind of thing?
Okay. Well, you can check out London Drawing at London Drawing. There's lots of different variations of London Drawing groups and all kinds of things happening on social media, but we're just simply London Drawing. So you can check out social media there, check out our website. You can have a look at the Crypt website, cryptgallery.org. And I don't actually have an Instagram for the Crypt Gallery because it's kind of complicated to run something like that. So it's under the radar in lots of ways, you know. So if you're listening to this show, then you know, like you're on the inside track with the Crypt Gallery.
It's a really hidden gem. I love it so much down there, and I'll continue to pop down there. And
and we've got quite a few student shows coming up over the next few weeks because at this time of year, you know, we've got a lot of kind of people coming out of college and sort of trying new things. If you want to check out London Drawing, we're working with an artist called Robert George Sanders. We're doing a big fashion illustration event online next Friday on the 29th. And we run classes across London, in person, online. You can drop in and do like 2 hours of live drawing, get some great tuition. You can do a workshop. We've got loads of stuff happening.
Brilliant. Well, I think that brings us up to our hour. So, Anne, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to speak to me and let me know about London Drawing and the Crypt Art Gallery. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Voices Radio.